Will they see?
We are now live on YouTube. We are currently live on YouTube.
So are you almost good, Mr. Gibson?
I am good, ready to go whenever you are. If you've got the whole board, I've got my staff ready.
Fair enough. Okay, the time is now 6 o'clock and I'd like to call this meeting to order. The board members are participating via Zoom meeting. I'd like to welcome those who are participating via Zoom and those watching the board meeting via live streaming. The link to the meeting is on the district webpage under Board of Education. The streaming will run through the end of the meeting. If the board is on break, the screen will fade to black and the sound will be muted. In the event there is a disruption in the audio portion, I'll pause the meeting until it is reestablished. We have Mr. Frank Otero participating via Zoom. Mr. Otero, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
We have Mr. Stephen Otero participating via Zoom. Mr. Stephen Otero, can you hear me?
I can.
We have Mr. D. Vickers participating via Zoom. Mr. Vickers, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
We have Mr. Hidon participating via Zoom. Mr. Hidon, can you hear me? Mr. Hidon,
Yeah.
you can hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you. And Mr. Gibson, can you hear me?
I can, Mr. Smith.
Thank you. Mr. Gibson, would you please announce a meeting?
I will. This meeting has been announced in accordance with the Open Meetings Resolution and is a legally constituted meeting of the Los Angeles Schools Board of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Gibson. Mr. Hidon, will you please lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Mr. Hidon. Brings us to item number 4. Mr. Gibson, are there any changes or deletions to the agenda?
There are none this evening, Mr. Smith.
Thank you. I'll stand for a motion on the agenda.
Mr. President,
Mr. Hidon.
I move to approve the agenda as presented.
Thank you, Mr. Hidon. I have a motion by Mr. Eloy Hidon to approve the agenda as presented by Mr. Gibson and the staff. I'll stand for a second.
I will second that, Mr. Smith.
I have a second by Mr. Vickers. Mr. Vickers, how do you vote?
Yes,
Mr. Frank Otero, how do you vote?
Yes,
Mr. Stephen Otero, how do you vote?
Yes.
Mr. Eloy Hidon, how do you vote?
Yes.
And I vote yes. That brings us to item number 5, approval of the consent items. I'd stand for a motion regarding the consent items.
Mr. President,
Mr. Frank Otero.
I move that we consent the entire consent sheet as presented tonight with the following exceptions. Item number 8C, approval of purchase. Hold on. Let me back it up. Item number 8A, Finance Committee items. Item A, it's approval of reports for October 2020. Schedule of checks written. And the next item is item number 8C, approval of purchase professional legal services over 40K, Threshold, Himes, Patrica, and Fester, invoice number 44196, 11,000 operational.
Thank you, Mr. Otero. I have a motion by Mr. Frank Otero to approve the consent sheet with the exception of item 8A, Finance Committee items. Meeting was held on November 10th, 2020. Approval of reports for October 2020. And item number 8C, approval of purchases, professional legal services over 40K, Threshold, Himes, Petrarca, and Fester, invoice number 44196-11,000. Out of operational, I will stand for a second.
I'll second that.
I have a second by Mr. Stephen Otero. Mr. Vickers, how do you vote?
Yes.
Mr. Frank Otero, how do you vote?
Yes.
Mr. Stephen Otero, how do you vote?
Yes.
Mr. Eloy Hedon, how do you vote?
Yes.
And I vote yes. For the benefit of the audience, all agenda items have been reviewed by the board members individually. Consent items are the action items on the agenda presented by the superintendent and staff for approval. If no discussion has been asked regarding these items by any of the board members, the items may be submitted for approval with one motion and one vote. That brings us to item number 7, Acting Superintendent's Report. Mr. Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. I'm going to meld together these two items tonight, remote learning update and then some other comments. As you know, beginning about 2 weeks ago, when COVID began to become quite a bad issue here in New Mexico and in Valencia County, I instructed our staff to go to a skeleton staff, which was a significant reduction in the people in our schools. And last Friday, when the governor again announced that we should have only essential workers in our schools, I met with the cabinet, and that press conference was at 1 o'clock. By 3 o'clock, we had put out a memo to the staff describing what we considered to be essential staff, which again is a significant reduction in the number of people in our schools. We sent them some guidelines for that. We had a conference call. So right now we are running with only essential employees in the schools. What that means in a school, for instance, is either the principal or assistant principal, a clerical person, and a custodian. And we asked that those folks in those various roles be rotated across the week so that those tasks would be shared. In other departments where it was more difficult to define, food services, maintenance and custodial services, transportation, again, we suggested essential staff only, and that those roles be adjusted so the work was being shared among all of our people. So we put that in effect last Friday, and of course we've begun to do it this week. So in terms of staffing, we are back to only essential staff being on site in any of our facilities. Beyond that, we have been making some adjustments because of issues that have arisen from remote learning. The longer that students are in remote learning, the more difficult it is to keep them attentive. So beginning second semester, if we continue with remote learning, we will be making some changes to the high school schedule to try and eliminate the very large groups that we had in place being instructed and moving back to smaller groups. We're finding that particularly in the core curriculum in English, math, science, and social studies, we find that we're having trouble keeping kids attuned to the teaching when there are too many kids in a class. A byproduct of that is we are beginning to become concerned about high school credits for graduation. And that's not just with our seniors, that's also with underclassmen, because if students fail courses, that means that they'll have to repeat those courses, and that's going to affect our graduation rate, not only now, but going forward. So our high school principals, our administrators, our counselors have really been working with students to make sure that they're on track to graduate. So that's become a real issue. Related to that is the issue of attendance monitoring. Our instructions from the beginning were if students log on to Zoom or complete their assignments, then we know that they're participating in those classes and they are considered to be present for that day. We are having more and more difficulty with our staff restrictions in following up on that. So we're concerned about attendance. We're concerned about students, and this is something that elementary principals have reported to me, that students are logging on in the morning for their literacy instruction, but not re-logging on later in the morning for their math instruction. So again, we're trying to get a handle on that. Teachers are making phone calls, counselors are making phone calls. If we have SROs available, they're doing the same thing. We're using pretty much everybody that we can. tomorrow morning, I've had focus groups with high school students and teachers. Tomorrow morning, I have focus groups with middle school teachers and elementary school teachers, 3 one-hour sessions to try and get some suggestions from the folks who are teaching our students about what we can do to do remote learning better. And I think we're all facing the fact that remote learning might be here for quite a while. Now, that said, we need to begin to have a discussion about second semester. We have one meeting in December. There's a lot of things to happen between now and then in terms of COVID and in terms of restrictions from the governor or the Secretary of Education. But I would say at our December meeting, you're going to need to make as a board some decisions about what we're going to do second semester. What I can tell you is that many of the districts around the state that have gone to a hybrid model or who have brought students back to schools are changing those patterns. And you've read about that in the newspaper. Santa Fe, Rio Rancho, a number of the smaller districts that were back in a hybrid schedule have found themselves going back to what we have done all along with remote learning. So that's an issue that we're going to need to talk about in December. And then the one last thing, I've had some commentary from special education parents concerned that we didn't bring our special ed students back in a 1-to-5 ratio, 1 teacher to 5 students, which was allowed. And they understand now that we can't bring anybody back given the restrictions from the governor. But if things get better, that is something that I'd like to also discuss with you. We have special ed parents who are concerned that not having face-to-face instruction for their students is deleterious to them. And I agree. So if we can find a way in the future to bring those students back in a 5-to-1 ratio or a 1-to-5 ratio, I'd like to propose that we do that. So things are moving along. We've identified the issues. We're trying to address them as we go. But it's just not the best situation for students in this district, across the state, or actually across the country. So that's where we are at this point in time. I would be happy to answer any questions.
Board members, comments, questions?
I've got a question, Mr. President. Steve Otero.
Mr. Stephen Otero.
Mr. Gibson, now that you've put this in place in reference to cutting back on staff, what is the mandate that you have for those that are working in the school that remain working in the schools? I was in your office this morning and you and Mr. Baca both, along with other staff members, were not wearing face masks. And I was just wondering if you're requiring that for all staff members while they're in the workplace.
We are when they're in common areas. Now, I remember when you came in, Mr. Baca was wearing a mask. We were meeting in my office. I was well more than 6 feet away from him, and I wasn't wearing a mask. So when I'm working in my office, I generally don't wear a mask. When I have a meeting with the executive staff or with other folks across the building, I put my mask on when I go into their office.
But what have you mandated to the staff?
Everybody wears masks. Everybody wears masks unless they're isolated in their particular area. So if there's a principal in their office and they're the only one there, they don't need to wear a mask. Anybody that comes into the building, a maintenance person, a food services person, they should be wearing a mask. And we take everybody's temperature as we did with you this morning.
Okay.
So you're actually probably right, Mr. Otero. I should have put my mask on when you came in. I guess I got too comfortable in my office.
Any other questions, comments?
Mr. President, this is Frank
Mr.
Otero.
Frank Otero. Yes.
I have a question for Mr. Gibson, and it's probably kind of related to the first item that you had discussed, and it's the electives. There was an awful lot of talk about kids not having, not being able to earn their elective classes, and
right.
That's also going to delay graduation or what have you, or the accumulated points. So I'm hoping that that's an issue that's
It is.
that's being
Mr.
looked at PED?
The one, so some electives, as you can imagine, our FFA classes, our ag classes, our welding classes, those hands-on classes, they're pretty hard to do. We did add some electives about a month or 6 weeks ago. What we're focusing on now is we have a contract with Apex to do remote learning for other electives. We're focusing on expanding that second semester. In particular, for those students who need the credits to graduate. We have identified those students who are at risk, as we always do, but we're going to really push those students to take these online electives from Apex so that they have enough credits to graduate.
Thank you.
Board members? So I have a couple of comments, and to piggyback on what Frank Otero said. So I agree that things are changing so quick. I mean, 2 weeks ago, you asked me, I thought we were on track to, maybe see the classroom here pretty soon, which is the ultimate goal, and which is definitely what I want. I mean, you can't beat in-person education, so we know that. But what has happened over the past couple of weeks is just somewhat short of amazing to me, the numbers of cases that have been going up and the number of deaths and stuff. And it's actually quite frightening. And you're right. This is a conversation that we need to have about the second semester very, very soon. And possibly before the December meeting, we may have to come together and say that. Is there any guidance from PED as far as what the graduation requirements are? Because I get that it's kind of hard to offer all of the electives, but I would like to see electives come back in any shape or form, ones that we actually can do depending on how we're attending school, whether it be remote or hybrid or wherever we're going. Because my opinion of electives is one, electives alone can keep some students in school, but also if they're fillers to break up the core classes, because core classes are very interesting to very few people, I think, especially students, and I would love to see our students do well in the core classes, but I'd also love to see them do well in the electives. And I understand maybe we can't have a welding class or something like that, but I would like to see us look forward to, and I'm not going to say what we're going to be doing in January, but I mean, if you read the news, there's a good idea of what we're going to be doing. But to incorporate, and as you said, more electives that we can bring in here, just to break up the day for these students and get them more involved in that. But back to my original question, has there been any guidance whatsoever to say, look, we understand if you're only doing cores and a few electives, your students, it's almost impossible to have enough credits to graduate. And like you said, and like I think I said at the last meeting, this affects our freshmen. I mean, affects everybody that's going to high school right now. So if you could just elaborate on those two things.
So the state has been very clear. PED has been very clear. 24 credits is the minimum number that students need to graduate. They also need to demonstrate competency, which they can do in a number of ways, and the state has given some flexibility around that. What I will tell you is we have a contract with Apex, which is an online learning. A student who is diligent and really pays attention to an Apex course, people tell me, the administrators tell me, that a student could earn a credit, a high school credit, in 6 to 8 weeks if they were diligent about it. So those students who lack credits, they have that opportunity to make up those credits using electives that are available in the Apex program. All three principals have been really very diligent in following up on students, knowing where they are, knowing what students were way ahead in their credits and don't need to worry about credits, and those that are on task, but maybe a little bit at risk, and those that are really at risk. I will try in the next couple of weeks because we're getting to the end of the first semester. I'll try to give you a clear number of how many students, seniors in particular, are at risk of not earning those 24 credits. The underclassmen, that's the kind of thing that compounds. If you, in your freshman year, you fail a course or two, you have to repeat them in your sophomore year. That takes away from the electives that you can earn in your sophomore year, and that compounds over time. So while I'm really concerned about the seniors, we want to make sure they graduate. I'm also concerned about our underclassmen and freshmen coming out of a middle school. When they're in a high school, they begin to understand the accumulation of credits and how you do it. But there's no such thing as credits in middle school. And so without having those students in front of us, without having class meetings, without having regular meetings with counselors, probably the freshmen really don't understand that you can't fail a course in your freshman year and still be on track to graduate. And if you fail more than one course, you're really digging yourself a hole. So we're trying to be really conscious about the seniors, but also focusing on the underclassmen. And it's a dilemma for everybody across the state. We're hearing the same question. Is the state going to make any further adjustments to the credits that are needed for graduation or the competencies that are needed for graduation?
Right. Thank you, Mr. Gibson. And also, I don't want to carry on a conversation about it. I just know that music, art, and band, I think these are some of the things that we could still be doing. And I don't know if we are or not, but
classes are continuing to some degree.
okay. Yeah. So I meant things like that. I mean, anything we can do to break up the monotony, because I got to tell you, I'm so proud of our kids for going to school and in this environment and being limited in the classes that they can take. And I know that they're doing the best that they can, and so is the staff. So I'm very proud of all of us. So it's a necessary thing that we have to discuss, not only next semester, but even up until right before the meeting. I've been asked about way into the future about graduation, how we're going to handle graduation and stuff. And even those are things that we need to start at least putting some attention to as to what we're going to do that far down the line as well.
And we actually have already begun the discussion with UNM about a date for the pit for graduation. So we're moving forward on that.
Perfect. Because we all know we want to be in the classroom and have a full-blown live graduation for our seniors and get back to normal. So hopefully we're on track for that health-wise, and we can make that happen, because I know that everybody wants to be there.
Yep, we do too.
Perfect. Thank you. Any more comments, board members?
Mr. Smith?
Sorry.
Hidon.
Hidon.
Mr. Hidon.
Mr. Smith, I just want to add, I heard what you have to say about the elective. And I heard our enrollment, I heard all the problems. I know where we're at. One thing I want to do is, we've been at this since September, and I want to thank the teachers just for adapting and rolling with this and for everything they've done, because I've been able to talk to a few teachers in the last couple of weeks, and I want to thank them. So, and just on behalf of myself and the rest, I'm sure the rest of you guys feel the same way, but I want to thank the teachers for this, what they've done and the way they've adapted to this. Thank you, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank
Hidon.
Thank you, Mr. Hiron. What they've done is really remarkable. I don't get to sit in on a lot of classes, but they are using every tool at their disposal, and it really is remarkable.
Perfect. Thank you, board members. Thank you, Mr. Gibson. The item was for report only, and no action is needed and warranted. That will bring us to item number 8A, Mr. Stephen Otero.
Mr. President, I was at the administration early this morning when I signed that consent form. After I left, my concerns were addressed, so therefore I'm good with the checks written. I got all my questions answered, so I no longer have any concerns.
Thank you, Mr. Otero. Does anybody else have any comments on item number 8A? That being said, I'll stand for a motion on item 8A.
I make a motion that we approve it.
Thank you, Mr. Stephen Otero. I have a motion by Mr. Stephen Otero to approve item number 8A, approval of reports for October 2020. I'll stand for a second.
I'll second that, Mr. Smith.
I have a second by Mr. David Vickers. Mr. Vickers, how do you vote?
Yes.
Mr. Frank Otero, how do you vote?
Yes.
Mr. Stephen Otero, how do you vote?
Yes.
Mr. Eloy Hedon, how do you vote?
Yes.
And I vote yes. That will bring us to item number 8C. Mr. David Vickers.
Was I the only one with discussion on this item?
You were not. I was just going in order. There's three, actually.
Okay. So
Maybe-
I was,
Mr. Smith, it would be helpful if I explain this item. So at your last meeting, you voted to do a 5,000 purchase order for limited professional services to Himes, Petrarca, and Fester. And it reads that this contract would be utilized to complete any unfinished business. Unfortunately, we did not get that contract returned from Himes, Petrarca, and Fester. So this bill is for just under $100 for a couple of phone calls that were made to the attorney that represents that firm. We couldn't charge them to the $5,000 contract because it hasn't been returned. So what we did is put it on this agenda in the same way we did last month to exceed the $40,000 threshold, but it is a bill for just under $100. So that's my explanation of why it's here.
Thank you, Mr. Gibson. Mr. Vickers?
well, I guess that answered most of my questions right there. I was just looking at the checks written file here, and we've got 45 pages of checks written, many of them well over $100, and we haven't been asked to approve those. So I just found it interesting that we're asked to approve this one. And I was interested in knowing why we have to approve it versus them just paying it like all these other checks that were paid. So I don't know if anybody wants.
It is because we do not have a current contract with Himes, Petrarca, and Fester. So if that contract that you approved had been returned, this would not be on the agenda as a separate item.
So the issue is the contract just hasn't been returned, so we have to do it this way,
That's correct.
Mr. Gibson? Oh, okay.
So I guess, where does that put us in regard to the state procurement statutes? If we're approving something with no contract, no PO.
It's not ideal, but you are still, I would guess, or estimate $4,000 to $5,000 under the state limit of $60,000.
Okay, I guess that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vickers. I think Mr. Frank Otero?
Yes, well, I had similar questions. The last time I went ahead and voted to approve that last purchase, but now that I'm understanding that the contract wasn't returned, I'm hoping we're getting to a point where we all don't all have to work in Santa Fe up at the state pen, but we've got to stop at some point in time. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Mr. Otero. Couldn't agree with you more. Mr. Stephen Otero?
I don't know if I signed that off as a discussion. I just know it's something that's of concern that should be out in the public. I don't know why it's nickel and diming this only, but I just thought, well, if they want it out in the open, let's put it out in the open. That's it. So Mr. Vickers is so correct in saying that it's kind of weird. You got $100 now that the board has to approve, but yet there's other purchases in there well over $100 that don't ask for the individual approval, but it's kind of odd. Anyways, I'm good with it.
Thank you, Mr. Stephen Otero. And further comment, board members? Thank you for the explanation, Mr. Gibson. I'll stand for a motion on item number 8C. Approval of purchase professional legal services over 40,000 threshold Himes, Petrarca, and Fester invoice number 44196-11,000 operational.
I make a motion, we approve this.
I have a motion by Mr. Stephen Otero. I'll stand for a second.
Second it. I'll second it.
I have a second by Mr. Eloy Hidon. Mr. David Vickers, how do you vote?
No,
Mr. Frank Otero, how do you vote?
Yes.
Mr. Stephen Otero, how do you vote?
Yes.
Mr. Eloy Hidon, how do you vote?
Yes.
And I vote yes. Motion carries 4-1. That brings us to item number 9, announcement of meetings. As allowed by the Open Meeting Act and District Open Meetings Resolution, on occasion, a quorum of board members attend the same function, including those held at school sites at the district level, as well as sports functions, conferences, workshops, and trainings. Board members will refrain from discussing and/or acting on board issues in those settings. In addition, only official meetings are published, and if other meetings are scheduled, they will be announced in accordance with the Open Meetings Act. I would like to announce the following meetings. The location of all these meetings is dependent on CDC mandates, and if needed, the meetings will be held via Zoom. December 1st, there's a Finance Committee meeting at 4 p.m. in the conference room. December 3rd through the 5th, the New Mexico School Board Association Annual Convention is being held, and that will be held via Zoom. They've already made that decision. There's a lot of good stuff in there and a lot of good training for new board members, so we should all make sure that we get in as much of that as we can in those 3 days. December 8th, there's a regular board meeting in the boardroom at 6 p.m. And again, the meetings are dependent on the mandates from the governor. That will bring us to item number 10, adjournment. I will stand for a motion to adjourn.
Mr. President, I move that we adjourn.
I have a motion by Mr. Eloy Hidon to adjourn. Stand for a second.
I'll second.
A second by Mr. Stephen Otero. Mr. Vickers, how do you vote?
yes,
Mr. Frank Otero, how do you vote?
Yes.
Mr. Stephen Otero, how do you vote?
Yes.
Mr. Eloy Hidon, how do you vote?
Yes.
And I vote yes. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, technology. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Good night.